Hi everybody here, and everybody, I think we're putting a video on the internet here later. My name is Shaun Lyons, and today I'm going to be presenting about my book, The Ukraine-Russia Information War, and taking a few questions about it as well. But first I'll give a little bit of background about me and about how this book came to being, why I felt the need to write it, and then we'll start with the presentation. My name is Shaun. I'm an attorney by background, and before that I served in the Peace Corps in Sumy Oblast in northern Ukraine for 2.5 years. I lived in a small city, like about 35,000 people, and worked with organizations like this, with the school a little bit, and with the city government on economic development projects. I lived in Chernihiv, also in northern Ukraine before that, and lived with a family. So just over the course of a couple of years, I came to know Ukraine quite well and learned the language a little bit. I lived in a region that speaks Russian and some Ukrainian. And so after that, I just kind of left Ukraine and went on to start a normal career, which was in the law. I went to law school at Georgetown in Washington, D.C., and focused on international law and international criminal law, which deals with the laws of war, while I was at law school there. And basically, spent 3 years in DC doing some research regarding war crimes tribunals during World War II, and kind of the international system that we built after World War II that was really meant to prevent things like the Holocaust from happening and to basically prevent these wars of aggression like what you saw in the Second World War. And perhaps surprisingly, that's held. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later, until recently. But so I became a lawyer, did a lot of internationally focused work, but ended up in a career that was very much about regulation, regulation of large companies, like internet companies, electric companies, and that sort of thing. And that's been kind of most of my background in my law career. But during that time, I've always had my eye on what's happening in Ukraine. I worked here as an election observer, and so last year I decided to start working on this book while working some in the law, and decided that I think there aren't very many people who have the same skill set that I have, which is a background in international law and the laws of war, and in this new information war that is taking place between Ukraine and Russia, but globally, is really unique. And I think the most unique aspect of it, which is difficult for a lot of people who haven't looked at like the files from Nuremberg to really comprehend, is how much information there really is in this war. Everything that happens in this war, somebody's capturing it on a cell phone, somebody is looking at it somewhere, and if, for instance, the Nuremberg trials were to happen today, what you would have is this extraordinary amount of documentation, and whereas the Nuremberg prosecution just targeted about, I think it was about 45 people, this one you have documentation on literally every soldier. Everybody has their cell phone with them or something with a GPS in it. And it creates this incredible opportunity to prosecute these crimes, but also there's a certain friction there in the wars, the end of wars, sometimes about forgiveness and sometimes about finding exactly who's responsible and maybe not being quite so focused on people who are just along for, because they're part of the army or something like that. So this is a test. This is important in its own right because this is a large country. This is the first European war in a very long time. But this is also a test of the system that was created after World War II that was meant to stop things like this from happening, and how it will respond to what's happened over the past few years here in Ukraine. So I felt a call to be able to write something like this, and that there aren't very many people who really understood what was unique about this war the same way that I do, and who could also understand why it's important to Ukraine, to Ukrainians, and to the people here who are dealing with this every day. So yeah, that's a little bit about myself. I come at this with the perspective of an American very much. I was born in the United States, and you know, you kind of, whatever you're born, glasses you're born with, you know, the way you see the world, it's hard to change that. So please forgive me to people who are not Americans for the Americanisms and some of the things that I say, but at that same time, I do, you know, I've spent time here to really try to get a feel for this and why these things are important. So that gets us to our first point here. Why is this war important and unique for everybody involved? For all the people who are at peace negotiations, who are talking about this conflict in the news and that sort of thing. Sometimes it's hard for Americans to understand the Ukrainian experience, for Ukrainians to understand the American perspective. And you know, when there are peace negotiations going on, or any sort of negotiations going on, it's very important that people understand each other. So obviously, why this war is unique and important to Ukraine is this is the first time Ukraine has been invaded in a very, very long time. The first time Ukraine has seen a real war in a very, very long time. The 1930s and 40s in Ukraine were exceptionally traumatic and difficult for Ukrainians. But since then, there was an extended period under the Soviet Union and in the first years of Ukrainian independence where things were relatively calm. And obviously, I don't think people who don't live here can really understand how stressful and difficult dealing with war is on a day-to-day basis for people here. So that is why it's important to Ukrainians. And then for Europe, it's a similar concern. Europeans are worried about their doorstep. You know, Ukraine is not particularly far away from Germany or from anywhere else. It's not just Polish and Romanians who worry about this. It's everybody. So Europeans care a lot about this war. They feel very close to it. You know, there are instances where missiles are, you know, going into Polish territory, going into Romanian territory, and that sort of thing. But Europe also has since World War II experienced this easing of tensions, and there's this desire to maintain peace at all costs. And I think that's been an overwhelming feeling of Europeans with relation to this war. The international system, since World War II, has basically had a series of wins, a winning streak of sorts, where war has happened, especially in Europe. There has been a victory for prosecutors. People have actually found and prosecuted the people who have done wrongs in those wars, and there's never been one quite as big as this war, where so much has happened. So the international system is gearing up for the possibility of prosecution, for the possibility of going after not just Putin, but anybody who's responsible for war crimes in this conflict. So yeah, that's why it's important for Europe. And then finally, we have the United States. A lot has been going on with the United States over the last few months. Obviously, the new presidential administration, all sorts of new things going on. And this is where, for me, I can speak most comfortably about, because this is kind of, like I said, where I was born and how I feel. So the United States has always felt this distance from Europe, from pretty much most of the rest of the world, and has a difficult time understanding, sympathizing sometimes with what it feels like to be invaded, to have your country invaded. The last time the United States was invaded was 1812, which is more than 250, or more than 220 years ago. So for Americans, there's this distance of thinking about the war. As you saw with Trump recently, there's this desire to get things, to try to get things peace at any cost, is kind of the Trump feeling. And that has created some problems. So I think what Americans need to understand is why this is a threat to the global system, and maybe to understand a little bit more about Ukraine and why this is more than just a war between two former Soviet countries that doesn't have any real bearing on what the United United States only experience. So, which gets us to, this is kind of one of the main points of the book. The book is basically split into three parts. One is the history of Ukraine and Ukraine situated within the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. And then the second part of the book is about this war and the things that led up to this war. And then the third part about this book is about the information war and the propaganda war and how we all live in this new environment of legal norms and digital norms that is changing the way that wars are fought. Especially for Americans, one thing that they have a lot of concerns about, and that you hear often from Americans, is that Ukraine and Russia are in very different places. Why should we be concerned about these two countries in a distant place fighting each other? And you know, basically, the idea is that it's the former Soviet Union kind of fighting a civil war of its own, or fighting some sort of political struggle, and that's not very important. And I think that the big idea, though, is that it is important in that this is about legal norms and legal rights, and the right not to be invaded is one of the paramount rights in the international legal system since World War II. So, as I put up there, you know, what's unique about Ukrainian history, there are things that are unique about Ukrainian history, but oftentimes we get kind of into these questions about language, about cultural distinctions and that sort of thing, and some of them matter. They do show that there are real differences between Ukraine and Russia, and Americans maybe need to know that. But the fundamental point is that the parties agreed these are the borders of Ukraine in the early 90s after Ukrainian independence, and in a sense, all of those questions are secondary to the real question, which is these are the borders of Ukraine, and you can't invade the borders of another country for almost any reason whatsoever, especially if you haven't been attacked or offended by them. And with the Budapest Memorandum, demonstrates that Russia agreed not to interfere with Ukraine in the 1990s. So, in a sense, the historical part of the book is meant for people who are not from Ukraine, people who don't really understand what makes Ukraine unique or Ukrainian history unique. For Americans, as I said, there's a desire not to support nationalism abroad. Even in the Trump administration, which is very nationalistic, there's this desire not to support, you know, any sort of nationalism, be it in the Middle East, in Europe, or anywhere else. And because of that, a lot of Americans, both on the left and on the right in the United States, don't feel comfortable supporting Ukraine because Ukraine is unique, which leaves Ukrainians who are arguing for support in this war arguing about fairness and the law, which are two very compelling reasons for Ukraine to have support in this war, and two reasons why that Americans can sympathize with and that Americans do understand. And this is, I don't mean this book as like or this presentation is even as like explaining how to win American support or something like that. But this is about winning the war for hearts and minds. Right now, the US is reconsidering, sometimes thinking about, you know, for what reasons they want to support Ukraine, and Russia is trying to win over Chinese support as well. And I think it's important for Americans to understand why this is an important conflict and why this is not necessarily, or not just about ethnicity or, you know, like Trump said, you know, hatred between peoples. As I read in the book, there are all these incredible connections, that historical connections between Russians and Ukrainians that I don't think Ukrainians want to throw away completely. They want to end the war, and they want from there to maybe rebuild a relationship with reconciliation and with real apologies from Russia. I think Americans do need to understand the differences between Ukrainians and Russians better, but I think that Russians and Ukrainians need to understand that for Americans it's not as important, and that maybe that's okay. You know, we all respect each other's cultures and look at each other's cultures as something unique and interesting, but that the real way of persuading America that this is important and that this is unfair is to say that this is unfair, this is against international law. And that's what I try to do with the book here. So, Good. So basically, what the book tries to do is explain Ukraine's role in the Soviet system and in the Russian system in a way that shows why there is this tension between countries, why there is this dislike, in Ukraine for, sometimes it seems like Moscow specifically, but for a Russian government that has always viewed Ukraine as its territory and as somewhere that can be kind of subjugated or be reconquered at any given time in history. Like I said, Ukraine was free from international wars for a very long time, but throughout serfdom, the Holodomor, all these various points in time, Ukraine was subject to something almost worse than war, which is subjugation, which is being unfree in a totalitarian system. So that's what part one of the book is trying to do, is explain to Americans why maybe they should pay a little bit more attention to the uniqueness of Ukrainians, and maybe to explain to Ukrainian readers or Ukrainian readers in Eastern Europe why that view doesn't just fit with something in the American mentality. It's just very difficult for Americans in particular, and I think Britons and some other countries to really be enthusiastic about supporting people in that situation. The other big question that the book addresses is how the law will actually respond to this conflict. It's one thing when a village in Bosnia is invaded and a small, not small, but where a city or one group of soldiers does something wrong, for the rest of the world to kind of gang up and say, this is wrong, this is how we're going to respond. It's a very, very different situation when the aggressor is historically one of the great powers, which Russia, despite some failings over the past 30 years, still remains on the UN Security Council. They are part of the G11, they're part of the G7, and still are part of the international community. So it's a lot easier to say to Serbia, when they get rid of their leaders, you need to put this person in jail, or even worse. But in this situation, dealing with a nuclear power and with one of the great powers, it is going to be more difficult to say we want every soldier who committed a wrong to be in jail. And sadly, overzealous prosecution of those where you're holding the wrong person responsible can actually make the peace process, a potential peace process, take longer and be more difficult. So the point is not that international law will not apply, but where there are ambiguities in international law, can Vladimir Putin be prosecuted, that sort of thing, it's going to be exceptionally difficult to get America on board with that. Whereas targeting specifically people who committed atrocities in places like Bucha and Irpin, and people who are involved in targeting decisions that are unlawful, regardless of whether a war is just or not, will probably be easier at the end of the day. So the book tries to examine, the legal bases for this war, but kind of comes to the conclusion that I came to up at the above, which is you don't have a right to invade another country without some threat of aggression towards you. And what it also does is, I'm American. I often look at these things from an American perspective. It looks at the history of international law, and that we've recently kind of used this right to protect, which is the right to stop a genocide, the right to stop war crimes, as a basis for invading other countries. The U.S. famously did that in Iraq. Other countries have used the same basis for their invasions, and it's kind of asking us to reconsider that and to look again at the importance of borders and the importance of respecting borders as the key tenet of international law. So what's happened is Russia has levied genocide allegations against Ukraine for what's happened in eastern Ukraine on the basis that Russian language is being targeted or that ethnic Russians are being targeted. And the book tries to detail, the veracity of those, each of those allegations, But more than that, it goes into the fact that we've created this dynamic where Russia is trying to say, oh, look how oppressed Russians are, and Ukrainians are saying, look how oppressed Ukrainians are. And I don't know that that's necessarily the proper inquiry for international law. I think the proper inquiry for international law is who has the right to invade somebody else's border. And the bases for overcoming that, absent a war, should be minuscule, should not really exist. So what you have here is Russia has made a bunch of allegations as to why this is a just war. Ukraine has attempted to rebut them, including at the UN in The Hague. But I think everybody kind of gets a sense that those aren't the real basis for this war. The real basis for this war is projection of power. So that's the second part of the book, is really an analyzing what happened in this war, from tracing it from the Orange Revolution to Yanukovych taking power the first time, to Maidan, and then the Donbass War, invasion of Crimea, and then this kind of long period where there was animosity. There seemed to be attempts at more than just a ceasefire, at some sort of resolution of the conflict, and all that culminated in a true invasion, which was what February 24th, 2022 was. It was an invasion without a basis at law. So that's part two, and that's, I think, for a lot of people, the most important part of the book. It's the part that addresses the real world consequences here, and I tried to use my legal knowledge and my knowledge of Ukraine to best describe that as I could. Before getting to the third part, which I think is very important, it's kind of unique to my skill set and to what I've learned in the course of my career and my education, which is this new environment that we all live in, which is the digital environment that we all live in, this rapid ability of political leaders to address everybody in the world immediately and get these messages out. When, again, the last time Europe saw a big conflict, it was like, letters being sent that took 2 weeks to arrive, or were sent by, from Britain to Russia, by air courier or something like that. It was this slow information environment, and this one, things can happen so quickly that it's not only is it new, it's very dangerous. I think the biggest example that we saw of this was dangerous actually to the Russian state and not to the rest of us, which makes us kind of feel like, oh, everything's okay. But the Prigozhin coup attempt of 2023 was a really obvious example of the war dynamic changing incredibly quickly based on the use of Telegram and the spreading of information. Suddenly, about 15,000 soldiers who had been fighting in Ukraine made their way into Russian territory and almost took over, made their way into Moscow. And while that might seem like a great thing, and it probably is a great thing if it had been successful, it's this extraordinary new environment that we're in where information moves incredibly quickly. Maidan was an example of this as well, and I think a positive example of what a free internet looks like. But it's also just, it's very new, and it has this aspect of risk to it. So the second part of the book is about Telegram specifically, about Starlink specifically, which I think most Ukrainians are more familiar with than Americans, and that we basically have this information environment where soldiers are sharing information with each other on Telegram, are sharing information with each other over the internet, without much confidentiality or anything like that. And I think it's actually led to not much happening successfully in the war, sometimes maybe for Ukraine even, and that there's no confidentiality, no secrecy at war, which makes war planning and that sort of thing very difficult. So the basis of the second part of the book is that we have this new system, Telegram, especially Telegram to Reddit, which most Ukrainians aren't familiar with, but Reddit is like the main discussion board kind of for the world. And through Reddit, very graphic videos are being shared constantly, throughout the world. Graphic stories and that sort of thing. And none of it is actually prosecutable at the end of the day in a war crimes tribunal, because none of it is authenticatable. It often gets shared on Telegram. You don't know who it's coming from on Telegram. Like with Prigozhin, some of it was recycled footage. And it leads to an increase of tensions, of people not believing what they see, without actually leading to justice, which is the prosecution of crimes, of things that happen that are evil. Excuse me for getting a little sidetracked there, but the idea is that in this age of digital sharing, we're having all these inflammatory posts, things like the Novakakova disaster, the nuclear disaster, or the nuclear near disaster that took place in Zaporozhye region and Chernobyl region, and that seems to increase this tension without resolving it in a way that the world community feels like justice will be done and that things will come to a just result. So the second part of the book focuses on that, and I hope that it doesn't disregard the seriousness of this conflict today, but I hope that it does justice to that, because someday we will know what happened to Bucha, what happened to Irpin, who was responsible for Novakakova. And again, we talked about secrecy. Sometimes, maybe it's okay in war that some of these things happen. But the idea is that we have this whole mess after the war, that somebody will need to do justice with all this information and all of that. And what are we going to do with it in a way that respects fairness and the rule of law? And one of the things that I've tried to do while here, in addition to kind of, taking in what's happened in places like that, is to talk with people, about the prospect of peace and, what's the idea, of a fair peace. And I think that, honestly, I think that for a lot of, let me try to put this the right way. So everybody talks about, the prospect of peace being good, but an unfair peace, as we put here, isn't necessarily a peace at all, or it isn't a good peace. It often leads to unfair results down the road or to resentment. So Germany signed on to a peace at the end of World War I that was in many ways responsible for the German political system getting very crazy after that period and turning into the German regime that led to World War II. There are other examples as well. The French and German wars led to some unfair border drawings that then led to additional wars. The Middle East is replete with this. The idea is that to have a just peace, we do need to use all these legal systems that we have to come to a just result. But as Abraham Lincoln said, you can't please all the people all the time. You can only please some of the people some of the time. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. The problem with justice sometimes is that it feels like it's not just for anybody, and that's a difficult aspect of justice and of negotiation as well. So the book tries to get into the nuance of that, and maybe that's the big picture, is that the first part is details that don't matter, except that they're colorful and they add context to this conflict, whereas the second is about details about the law that matter a great deal, because where we are in this conflict is that a lot of people are looking at the possibility of prosecution, the possibility of legal problems, in addition to all the sanctions and all those things that have been levied against Russia. And the idea is, how do we do that in a smart way that's just, that doesn't lead to more war, to more anger and more resentment? But you're always balancing those things. You can't just try to cover up the resentment and try to end the war as quickly as possible. That's not a real just peace, and that, as history teaches us, almost never leads to a durable peace, to a flourishing of people, which, again, is maybe the third thing that is really persuasive to Americans, is the idea that we're actually helping this to get better, that some good will come of this, that Ukraine will be protected and developed and have a safe place for people in the future. These people like Elon Musk, who suddenly have this extraordinary power to turn off the internet during an attack on Crimea, or Mark Zuckerberg can ban the phrase, the hashtag, Russia is a terrorist state. He banned that completely with no oversight. There's no law that would prevent him from doing that, and that would allow him from doing that. And what you have is, for the first time in history, corporations and people like that have this extraordinary power to move world events in a really serious way. And it's not always visible to us as well. Internal decisions at places like Facebook or Telegram or Starlink are secret by their nature. They're part of this company's decisions. So the book goes into kind of trying to untangle this in a way that makes sense. How we are going to have a digital world where we do justice in general, and where Maidan can happen, but the worst aspects of social media and of information sharing, which involve ganging up on people, which involve, sharing personal information or, private information and that sort of thing, isn't allowed. And the two kind of poles of this are Facebook, which is the biggest social media company, including Instagram in the world, and Telegram on the other side. Telegram is completely unmoderated. Facebook is moderated, with AI, with humans, thousands of humans working on it. How do we, in the future, allow societies to breathe so that things like Maidan can happen, or at least, the positive aspects of Maidan, while not allowing, just a complete free-for-all where you can share any information about anybody on the internet anytime you want, without this person having any right or any ability to curtail it. So that's kind of the third part of the book. And like I said, I want to be very clear that I don't find that to be the most important part of the book, but that's my contribution. That's what I'm able to talk about. And as far as the recommendations for the future, it talks about Telegram not being an exception to the general rule that each of these companies has to comply with local law, including Ukrainian law, which Telegram has not generally done, and basically how that's important to the war and to this idea of justice in the digital age. That's one of the main recommendations of the book. The big question that a lot of Americans have when I bring up this book is, why hasn't Ukraine banned Telegram? And I think the answer is that we all use it every day. We all use it, for pretty much every messaging that we do, and we kind of do it because other people are using it. So nobody is willing to be the first person to say, I don't want to use it, because they would basically be socially isolated. They wouldn't be able to contact any of their friends, anything like that. So you get to the next level up, which is the Ukrainian government has said many times, we're going to ban Telegram if we have any evidence that they're sharing information with the Russian state. And they don't have any evidence of that. But that's not necessarily because Telegram isn't doing it. It's because Telegram is a multinational company that isn't cooperating with the Ukrainian government. So at the end of the day, you have this question of who's in charge. The Ukrainian government should be in charge of its information systems, or a Russian company, or an American company. And all these are happening at the same time. A very serious war is happening, but that doesn't make either of them less important. And that's kind of what makes this war unique for everybody, is that we're living in a new digital age where there will be prosecution for things that have digital documentation. Who's going to push for what? Will Americans push for justice or just for peace? Will Telegram push for their corporate profits, or for being part of a community that includes other companies that provide information to people? So it's a complicated book. It's a complicated set of ideas, but I think that's the big idea: is how do you do justice in war, and how do you do justice in this new digital age where a state being a country isn't as powerful as it used to be, or is just one among many in a kind of a digital community. Thank you. With that, if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. I know it's a lot, kind of information overload a little bit here, but thank you. I appreciated being able to give this talk.